Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're listening to Season 2, Episode 8 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was recorded on March 24th, 2024. For more information about the podcast, please visit straypointers.com. Well, this episode, I thought we'd take a departure from the interview format. As April Fool's Day is coming up, I thought I would share some of the funny things that I've either participated in, heard about, or had happened to me in my almost 40 years of working in information technology. One of the first things that happened to me in my first week as a COBOL developer way back in the late 80s was a prank that a coworker played on me as I left my desk and I left my terminal open so that anybody could type in anything they wanted. You know, one of the things that they used to do to new developers when they came in was they'd go to ISPF, our menuing system under TSO, and they would change some of the hotkey assignments, which normally just had a word or a phrase that would trigger a particular function. One of those functions was swap. Now, one of the pranks that was played on me was the personal function key that correlated to swapping over to another screen, another session in ISPF, associated itself with the command swap, which you could just issue on the command bar, but the function key was a sort of a fast way to issue that as a macro. One of the jokes that people used to play was they'd hop over to your macro key definitions and change the word swap to say swapping not allowed at this point. Now, if you happen to hit that key, because the command was invalid, it would just sit there in your command bar. So I left my terminal, I came back. In a few moments, I went to go from an editor screen over to viewing what was in the job queue or something like that. And the machine told me swapping not allowed at this point. So it took me a few minutes. I asked around. I had to go over to my keyboard definitions. And sure enough, one of my cube neighbors had changed my settings and everybody laughed. Well, not me, but it was a funny incident. Around that same time, one of my coworkers had been complaining about losing information on diskettes that they used to kind of track their time in a spreadsheet on one of the two PCs that we had on the floor. This was predominantly a mainframe shop at the time. They claimed that they didn't know what happened. They took care of the disk very well as they stuck it to the side of their cube wall with a magnet. Now, I know that this is a meme that kind of goes on the internet, but I actually saw it happen. And then we had to have a little discussion about magnetic media and what happens when you run a magnet across a floppy diskette. On the mainframe, under TSO, there was a messaging facility that used to let you send little instant messages to other people with other terminals in the organization. I think the command was TSO space send, and then a user ID, and then a message. And you could, nudge people, communicate with them quickly, much like we do today with Teams or Jabber or something along those lines, but on a much smaller scale. Well, if you didn't happen to put the username as the third parameters, TSO space send space username, if you didn't put a username in there, it would go to everybody in the organization. One of my fellow programmers sent a message. He was trying to send it to a single person, and he said, "Get to work." And it went to everybody with a terminal in the organization. And we all sort of laughed about that. And then we laughed harder when we got a message back from some of the computer operators in our computer room who said, "We are working. We're not programmers." A little later, I had moved on to a team where we worked on C programs for MS-DOS and a little bit of assembler here and there and that sort of thing, a little bit of 8086 assembly. And we used to play tricks on each other from time to time. Mine usually involved ones I had written as terminate but stay resident software. And that is little pieces of software that I could get to run on people's machines that would sit in the background and then do something nefarious. One of those was a numlock key toggler. It actually didn't toggle the numlock key. It sat in the background and changed the numlock state to a state that I knew my fellow programmer Bob did not care for. Someone would come up and use his PC to demonstrate something. And when she did this, she would turn his numlock key either on or off. I can't remember which it was. Bob preferred one state versus the other. So, of course, I made a little memory resident program that would switch it to the state that he didn't like. And if he'd go to switch it back, in just about 30 seconds, it would switch to that state again. Now, this didn't last very long. I had left a trail in memory had he listed the items running in memory, which we used to do with a little utility called mapmem. He would have seen a message there that just said, "Hi, Bob." But he didn't get that far. As soon as it turned back on, he just turned and yelled my name. I don't know how he knew it was me. We had a coworker who we used to refer to as Chewie because he was big like Chewbacca. I had been reading some of the BIOS documentation for changing the MS-DOS cursor in the BIOS. And you could actually take, if you had a flat line cursor, not the block, not the solid block cursor, but you could make that line appear in just about any position vertically that you wanted to. It was a horizontal line, but you could make it appear at the top instead of the bottom or the middle or just about any spot in between. Well, I wrote a memory resident program that would change that every half second or so that it moved from top to bottom and then started again so that the cursor looked like it was starting at the top and moving down. I put this on a machine that Chewie was using and waited for him to come and tell us what the behavior was. And he came and got me, and I went over and looked, and I told him his cursor was broke. And he sort of laughed at me, but I just kept a stone face. And our coworker Dave joined us, and I think Dave had figured out what I had done. And I had said, "Yeah, just go over to the infrastructure folks and get them to order you a new cursor, Chewie." He laughed at first, but again, Dave and I were just stone faced. And Dave said, they're not very expensive. You should be able to get it. And so Chewie nodded his head and he walked over that way. And then when he turned back to ask us a question, Dave and I were doubled over with laughter. So he knew that something had gone on there. Dave, a prankster in his own right, I believe was the guy behind a TSR, a memory resident utility that would take the current DOS text screen and flip it, basically rotating it 180 degrees so that the screen was upside down. I don't know that the text characters were upside down or anything like that, but the letter in the top left, when it flipped, would then have been in the lower rightmost corner, that sort of thing. So he would do that. It would last about a second, and then it would just flip back. Dave had actually planted this on someone's computer, and one of our higher ups was walking through the area. He peeked in somebody's cube just as this executed. He saw the screen flip and flip back, and we all watched him see this, and he just came out of the cube, shook his head, and moved on. One of the last memory resident programs I did that was sort of a trick was to our coworker Paul. We were experimenting with the use of the FoxPro database system in 16-bit Windows, and Paul had no love for FoxPro, and he made that well known. What I had found in reading a book, I had found a mechanism that permitted one on the MS-DOS side to specify Windows routines that should, or Windows programs rather, that should load up and run when Windows ran. So in the old days, you started an MS-DOS, you used to type Win to run Windows. Well, if you had executed my particular program on the DOS side before you ran the Win command, you would get this program that would load and run in the background. So not only did I have a DOS program running in the background to do this, but it then caused a Windows program to load in the background. And what that Windows program did was constantly update the wallpaper so that it was the Fox Pro logo. Paul saw this. He booted up his machine, went into Windows, saw the logo, thought it was very funny that somebody swapped his wallpaper. He laughed. He clicked the, right click the button. He went back to set his wallpaper back to what it was. And as he was still chuckling about it, he watched it change again. Now, I had used a couple of tricks in doing this because I had named the executable with a character represented by the extended ASCII value of 255, which was unprintable. So you could embed that in the autoexec.bat and it would run alt255.exe, but it looks like a blank line if you bring up this autoexec.bat batch file in an editor. So it was very hard to see this sort of thing. In addition to these pranks, there were just a number of mishaps that happened over the years. One of which was the announcement of a team that was referred to as the Fast Action Response Team, which got a chuckle out of a number of other teams as it was announced at a rather large IT get-together. I'll let you all put together the acronym that's formed from the words Fast Action Response Team, and I think you'll understand why we were all laughing like a bunch of juveniles. My coworker Gary got called to help someone whose printer wasn't working. They had no paper. That was the problem. At the time, not everyone in the populace had their own computers at home, or they probably didn't even have experience with PCs in the tech schools or colleges. They just didn't know that they needed to feed some old tractor feed paper into the printer in order for it to print. My coworker John once was overseeing an imaging system that we used, and one of our customers had called to say that there was a problem with it. We weren't quite sure which version of the software that this customer got, so John had told him, I really need to get a copy of that disk so I can tell you for sure what the issue might be. So the customer promptly faxed him a picture of the disk. John, in a very professional manner, managed to fix the situation. One of our PC technicians got called to someone's desk because they had a problem with their computer. And again, this is back when not everyone had a computer at home. The technician asked them to power off their computer completely and power it back on. And they did so, but it seemed like they did so very quickly. And he says that the error message is still there. The technician asked, what kind of computer do you have? And the person replied, Princeton, which was the brand of monitors that we were using at the time. So the whole time the technician was asking him to reboot his computer, the gentleman was turning his monitor off and back on, expecting something different to happen. So he had to be educated on how to actually reboot the machine. My coworker Quentin had an interesting experience when he went out on an on-site visit where they were having a problem with the computer that one of our systems was running on. It was making an odd sound, they said. That's about all they said. It's making an odd beeping sound. So Quentin went out to take a look, and I believe this was used for file transfers or something like that. So it was kind of an out-of-the-way, back room sort of computer. They had it in a small room. And when they led Quentin there, he could hear the beeping. And what the beeping sounded like was the beeping that happens if you were to hold down a key on the keyboard too long. When the keyboard buffer fills, or it's the way it used to happen, it would start beeping with every keystroke that would repeat. Well, when he opened the door, what he saw was the computer was sitting there and the keyboard was turned over, sitting on something, a chair, I think. So the keys were on the bottom side of the keyboard. Keyboard was upside down, and a bucket was on the bottom part of the keyboard, which was now turned upright, so it's at the top, catching rainwater from a leak they had in the roof. So to them, this keyboard was effectively just like a 2x4 that they needed to have a smooth surface to put the bucket so they could catch the rainwater. And what happened was, as the rainwater filled the bucket and pressed down on these keys, lo and behold, the keyboard buffer filled and they got these noises. Well, Quentin fixed the situation, gave them a little education on the do's and don'ts of, how to treat PC hardware. At this time, I should mention a key figure in the pranks that went on in the organizations where I've worked. Her name's Kathy. She was a master prankster. I think she used to buy rubber cement by the gallon because she used to, in my earliest days in working with her, used to regularly rubber cement staplers and things like that down to people's desks. And the hijinks got better than that. One of my favorites of hers was when she put confetti inside the umbrella of a particularly curmudgeonly coworker that we had. And when he took it out in the rain and popped it open to avoid the rain, this guy always wore very nice suits and ties and white shirts and everything. He was just covered with confetti. She was an expert in packing styrofoam packing peanuts into the cubicle cabinets that we had that used to sit above our desks. There was usually an opening in the rear of these cabinets, and you could start to shove styrofoam packing peanuts up in there to the point where they would be leaned up against the door so that when someone opened their cupboard in the morning, all of these styrofoam peanuts came out. And that happened a lot. Actually, an even better joke than any that I have mentioned was we used to wear suits to work, and we'd often take the jackets off and hang them outside of our cube, go to lunch, and we just didn't wear our jackets to lunch unless we were going outside. If we were staying inside the premises, the jackets stayed on the hangers. Well, my coworker Dave went to put his jacket on at the end of the day and nearly tore the sleeve out because while it was sitting there when we went to lunch, Kathy had sewed the sleeve shut on what I believe was the right arm of his jacket, which was the first that he put in there. Kathy picked up an accomplice named Beth, and between the two of them, they did some things like putting police tape across cubes as a crime scene. They found that the drawers that we had would in our desks would actually slide in upside down. They were symmetrical at the mechanism that slid in, so they can actually put desk drawers in upside down. They managed to pack everything in them upside down so that if you pulled the drawer out, all of your items then dumped on the floor. One of their particularly greatest pranks was swapping the calendars, the schedules from our two managers who had identical folios. They popped open these folios and these were loose ring bound. So they took out, I don't know, 3 or 4 days or maybe a couple of days worth of schedules. It might have even just been a page for a day. And they swapped them from one calendar to another. So one of our managers was going to meetings that were meant for the other. The same with the other. The two were going to meetings that weren't theirs. I should note that I left the company for a little while in 1995, and we had a little goodbye lunch. They had a goodbye lunch for me. We started talking like I am now about all of the things that Kathy had done. And I mentioned, you've never gotten me. I didn't think anything more of it than that. The next day was my last day. And when I went into my office, I pulled out my chair to sit down. I got there usually earlier than anybody, and the chair shot back underneath my desk. The front two wheels had been rubber banded to two legs of my desk so that if you pulled it out, it immediately went back underneath the desk. As I went through my workday, I found all sorts of things going on with my desk, and I knew exactly what had happened. My morning hadn't gotten off to too much of a start before the phone rang. And when I went over to pick up the phone, the entire phone mechanism came up because Kathy had rubber cemented the handset to the base. So I had to rip the handset off. I'm not sure what the person on the other end actually heard, but I had left the company and I had actually left something behind there. I'd actually left a jacket hanging back on the other side of my office door. I forgot to take it with me. So I had called the person who had replaced me. I knew him. We had interviewed him before I left and got him hired. I asked if I could come up and get my jacket. And when I went up there, he says, "Yeah, I noticed there were some weird things about your desk. I tried to use the stapler and it seemed to be kind of glued down to your desk." So I had to talk through the whole situation with, I had to explain some of Kathy's antics, and we got a good laugh out of that. When I left the company, I came back in through a subsidiary company, and we had hired a gentleman named Keith. And Keith just happened to be from Canada. I can't remember exactly where Keith was from. There were a number of funny things that Keith did, but I think the one that stands out was when he had bought some Dilbert boxer shorts thinking that they were outer garments. And he was running around the office basically in his underwear, not realizing it on one day. Manager there stopped him and asked him if this was some sort of a Canadian holiday where they could wear underwear, but Keith soon went home and got some proper outerwear on. I worked with a gentleman named Dave, not the one that I've talked about so much so far. This other Dave was an electronics specialist. He could code, he can just do all sorts of things. But a couple of the things that he used to do was, as far as pranks, he had once flipped the speakers in a phone handset. He flipped the mouthpiece with the earpiece, basically, so that when you picked up the phone, you had to speak into the earpiece and listen in the mouthpiece. He did this to his boss and then called him. He showed us it didn't really take much to do. He didn't have to solder or do anything. He just used a pair of pliers, because I watched him do it, a pair of long nose pliers, as I watched him tear into company property. But it was kind of a funny gag. The other thing that he did was actually just bought a remote control bubble machine, and he would place it under various people's desks on April 1st. And at some certain point in the day, he'd just press a button and bubbles would start pouring out of, so these big soap bubbles would start pouring out from under these people's desks. Our coworker, Brian, had left on leave, and we wanted to play some pranks on Brian. So some of the people had some particularly innovative pranks that they played on him. His sweater that he used to keep outside of his cubicle was swapped with a sequined dress that someone had gotten from a costume from a high school dance recital or something like that. His PC was moved so that it was in the sunlight. He didn't really care to have the monitor in the sunlight. A couple of the keys on his keyboard were swapped. So we swapped the S and the A key, so he couldn't type his password in very likely. That was kind of a common prank that some people played on each other. There was a small slip of paper taped over the fan on his PC tower, just on the outside. And if you've never done this, I don't know that we'd ever actually seen this done before, but it sounded like a leaf blower starting up when you started up the computer. So when Brian got back from his leave, there was just all sorts of things going on with his PC, and we all laughed, and he knew who the culprits were. Brian had set his mind to get some revenge. So one of the culprits was an avid weightlifter and exercise buff, and used to bring in a protein shake mix that he'd mix with milk every day before he'd go and lift weights and do a workout. Brian came in one day with a box of pancake flour, dumped all of this person's protein shake mix out while this person was gone, and replaced it with pancake flour. And then everyone waited patiently as this person went to try to drink what he thought was protein shake mix and milk, which was actually pancake flour and milk. He didn't have it in his mouth very long. That was probably better than the combined pranks that were played on Brian to get him to that point. I'll close with a couple stories here. One I was a part of, and one was told to me. So we had a coworker named Jerry. I used to have a coworker named Jerry. And to play jokes on him on April 1st, one of the things I did for him was I had swapped the left and right mouse buttons in the settings on his PC. So if you were to try and left click on something, it would actually right click on it, which usually brings up some sort of a pop-up menu instead of running things. And, I was over there watching this. I didn't let this go on too long or he wouldn't have been able to function for the workday. And then we fixed it. Our coworker Kent came over to me and said he had a better idea for an April Fool's joke on Jerry. Jerry used to park very close to the entrance to the building. And in fact, I think he was parking in an area that he wasn't supposed to, but he used to leave his keys in the car. So what Kent wanted to do was go get in Jerry's car and move it up one level in our parking garage. So Kent did this. After he did this, he came back and said, okay, it's moved. And we were going to walk out with Jerry at the end of the day and see what would happen when he noticed his car missing. Well, right after this happened, I walked over to Jerry and I told him about it. And I said, what would be funnier is if you moved it up one more level. So Jerry went out and moved the car up one more level and then came back in. So the end of the day comes. Jerry and Kent and I are all walking out. We walk up to the spot where Jerry's car had been originally, and it's gone. We laughed a bit, and Kent said, it's an April Fool's joke. We moved it up one level. And Jerry breathed a sigh of relief, and we walked up one more level, and the car was gone. Remember, Jerry had moved it. And so Jerry and I at this point cannot look at each other because we're going to lose it. And Jerry does his best crazy person imitation, just going crazy, asking who would want to take his car? Why did this happen to him? Why did Kent have to move it up there? Kent was just almost paralyzed in fear. And then Jerry and I just both broke up laughing. And so we went up the extra level, and there it was. Now, part of the funnier thing about that was Jerry stopped parking that close, but he also stopped bringing his keys or leaving his keys in the car. And as such, he kept forgetting them on his desk because he just wasn't used to, he didn't keep them in his pockets and he wasn't used to having to have them on him. So I saw him leave one day and then he came back in to get his keys and he just pointed at me and says, I blame you for this. The last story I'm going to tell is one that was imparted to me by my coworker, Chris, who Chris and I only worked together for a short time, but I thought this was a very interesting story. Chris had worked as a desktop support tech for a company. I'm not sure what the company was or what type of work they did, but he got called to the desk of a person that had gotten a new PC, and they said that the new PC was eating the 3.5-inch diskettes. They put in a 3.5-inch disk in the drive, and it would disappear. So Chris thought, well, they're not putting it in right. They're putting it in one of the, places for an open slot. They've wedged it in there or something like that. So he came down and he took the cover off the PC thinking he was going to find a bunch of diskettes in there, and there were none. So with the cover off, Chris had them put a 3.5-inch disk in, and then he and the person had a little bit of a conversation. And when he looked down, the button on the floppy drive faceplate had been popped out. And when he went and looked, there was no diskette to be found. So they tried it again with another diskette, and this time he sat right next to the PC, keeping his eyes right on the PC. And what he saw happen was the spring on that little button must have been faulty. And after just a few moments, it would release and eject the diskette out of there. Now, it ejected it with such force that it kind of shot it a few feet. And when they turned and looked, there was a plant that had, I don't know, 9 or 10 diskettes in the base of it in the dirt that had been shot over there over time as this person had tried to put them in his PC. So mystery solved. If you followed along, I thank you for listening. Let's do this again soon. Take care.